Okay, continuing with our review. The third course outcome, be able to define the basic terms in Hinduism. Here they are. Brahman, the absolute, the supreme reality. Atman, the soul or self. Karma, the law of cause and effect. What you do will eventually come back to you. Samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And then moksha is liberation from this ongoing cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And then finally, dharma. Dharma is a word that can mean conduct, path, way, truth. Remember that Hinduism is called by practitioners of Hinduism. Hinduism is an exonym, meaning that it's a term from outsiders. People who actually practice Hinduism might say, I follow the Sanatana Dharma, which means the eternal path or the eternal truth. Number 4, be able to articulate the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. Okay, number 1, all life is suffering. Number 2, suffering is caused by desire, and the word could also mean clinging, attachment, or craving. Number 3, suffering can be extinguished. In fact, the word nirvana actually comes from the word that means to extinguish. And then the 4th noble truth, the path to the elimination of suffering is the eightfold path. And the symbol for that is this wheel, the Dharma wheel. And the eightfold path, you might remember, includes things like right concentration, right view, right effort, right livelihood, and some other things which sort of formulate the actual living daily practice of Buddhism. But I want you to remember those 4 noble truths. 5th course outcome, be able to discuss the meaning of selected chapters from the Tao Te Ching. First of all, let's get this right. The more modern spelling is not Tao Te Ching, but Tao Te Ching. Tao Te Ching. That's the Pinyin romanization, which is more to be, or the more modern way of doing it. Tradition says that the Tao Te Ching was written by Lao Tzu. You might remember this story. Lao Tzu was heading west, going into retirement, but the guard at the western gate said, before I let you pass, write down all your wisdom. And tradition says, although this is doubted by modern scholars, but tradition says that Lao Tzu at that point wrote what we now have as the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is chiefly concerned with the Tao. The Tao is that impersonal ultimate reality in Taoism. The best translation for Tao is the way. The way. The way is the ultimate source of all else, and it is impossible to describe in human language. Now, what does the word Tao Te Ching mean? It means the classic of the way and its virtue. Jing is a Chinese word that means a book, or more specifically, a spiritual book or a classic book. De means virtue, and Tao means the way. So Tao, the way, De, virtue, Jing, classic. The classic of the way and its virtue, Tao Te Ching. This book is very terse, it's cryptic, and it's apparently profound. I love the way that the guy that makes the Cogito videos explained it. He said you could read it in an afternoon, but it would be a very confusing afternoon. The Tao Te Ching uses a lot of apparent contradiction and paradox. It's very mysterious. There's a lot of, okay, you think this, but it's really that, or paradox, terms that seem to contradict each other. And so here's a great example. These are the opening lines of the Tao Te Ching. And one thing you need to understand, I'm giving you this as it's translated in our book, Sacred Text of the World, edited by Ninian Smart and Richard Hecht. But the Tao Te Ching has been translated many times. And the translations are all different because Chinese is a hard language to translate into English. So you may read this Tao Te Ching chapter 1 in another translation and it may sound totally different. But in Sacred Text of the World, it sounds like this: the way that can be followed is not the eternal way. So the way, that means the Tao. So the Tao that can be followed is not the eternal way. The way that can be followed is not the eternal way. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. So what this is saying is the Tao, or the way, if you're following it, if you think you have grasped it, then you haven't grasped it. If you think you've got it, then you haven't got it. The real Tao is something ineffable, and that's what you could say is sort of that goes in your outline there, okay? The Tao is ineffable. You can't understand it. You can't name it. You can't follow it. And yet, it is the beginning of heaven and earth. It is the source of all else. Okay, course outcome number 6, be able to describe a basic history of the 3 Abrahamic religions. Of course, those are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Let me give you that history very quickly. Of course, what I'm doing here is I'm grossly oversimplifying, and I'm rushing through almost a whole semester's, well, a half a semester's of work. But just to try to refresh your memory, the history of Judaism, it begins with Abraham. You remember that God told Abraham, I will bless you, and your descendants will bless all nations. All nations, all peoples will be blessed through your descendants. And so Abraham was the beginning of, God makes a covenant with Abraham. He is considered the father of all the Jewish people. His descendants became slaves in Egypt. They were there for just over 400 years, and then Moses led the Exodus from Egypt. And that's where you get the Passover, the 10 plagues. And so they went through the desert for 40 years, and then they entered the Promised Land. The Promised Land is the modern-day state of Israel. There they built their first temple. Solomon built the first temple. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then the people of Judea were carried off into exile in Babylon, and that's where we get the Babylonian exile, and the diaspora being those who were scattered. Some Jews were scattered throughout the world. Most of them were carried off to Babylon. At the end of the Babylonian exile, they return to the Promised Land. They build the second temple, and it's the second temple that is there when Jesus comes on the scene. And so the history of Christianity, which also developed in Palestine, which is modern-day Israel, begins with that second temple period of Judaism, during which we get the life, the death, and as the followers of Jesus believe, the resurrection of Jesus. The followers of Jesus believe that after his death, he came back to life. Following the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we get the early church in Jerusalem. And then coming out of that period, we have the conversion of Paul. Remember, he had been a Jew named Saul who persecuted the early church. He's converted to Christianity, and he begins to spread the religion to the Gentile world through his 3 missionary journeys. Now, That would be the 1st century CE. Moving into, let's not forget this, the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Very important date to remember. Why? Because some scholars would say this gave birth to 2 religions. Modern day rabbinic Judaism, which is no longer based on the temple and sacrifices and priests, but is now based in synagogues where rabbis lead prayer and study of Torah instead of sacrifices in the temple. The other religion, of course, Christianity. This might be sort of the beginning of the break between Judaism and Christianity, the time when the Gentile believers in Jesus began to see themselves as belonging to a different religion, not just as belonging to a sect in Judaism. And so, Judaism, Christianity, and then along about the 6th century CE, in the Arabian Peninsula, which is modern-day Saudi Arabia, Islam begins to develop. We have Muhammad, who was born in 570 CE. Muhammad was a very virtuous man who became a businessman. Early in his life, he begins to write the Quran, or actually the Quran is revealed to him by the angel Gabriel, and then he recites it to someone else. The word Quran actually means recitation. Later, we get the migration to Medina. The Muslims are persecuted in Mecca, and so they move to the city of Medina. There, they grow into a strong community, and then later they return to Mecca, and Muhammad dies in Mecca. After the death of Muhammad, you get the split between the Sunnis, who follow the Sunnah, or tradition, and the Shias, who are the party that want to follow, their party is more focused on leadership. That split happens after the death of Muhammad, and then you get the very rapid spread of Islam. Within just over 100 years, Islam has spread from the Arabian Peninsula west into northern Africa and Spain, east almost to China. Course outcome number 7, be able to define contemporary branches of Judaism. And so they are the Reform branch. This is the progressive or liberal branch. They don't keep kosher. They don't observe all the rituals and laws. They emphasize ethics. And this would be about 35% of American Jews. The Orthodox branch. These are the very traditional Jews. They keep kosher. They observe all rituals and laws. They emphasize obedience to Torah. This would be 10% of American Jews. And then conservative Judaism, which is sort of a middle way between Reform and Orthodox. They do keep kosher. They observe most of the rituals and laws, but with more room for interpretation than the Orthodox allow. And they emphasize tradition. This would be 18% of American Jews. Course outcome number 8, be able to define contemporary branches of Christianity. And so the big first split in Christian history happened in 1054 AD. This was called the Great Schism of 1054. I said AD. I'm sorry. That picture says AD. I should have said CE. AD stands for Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord. CE stands for Common Era. Anyway, the split was between the Catholic or Western Church and the Orthodox or Eastern Church. The Orthodox churches were mostly Greek-speaking. The Catholic churches were mostly Latin-speaking. The Catholic Church was headquartered in Rome. The Orthodox churches had headquarters in Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And then, of course, the next big split happened in the 1500s with Martin Luther. who started what's called the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther was a German monk and a professor. He railed against indulgences